Now let's talk about the list style staple post, or the listicle as it's affectionately called. This is a type of blog post that's going to start to differ in more substance from the post recipe. Rather than having an answer target at the very beginning in a paragraph style, the primary answer target for this type of blog post is the list itself. And we're going to list out each item in the subheadings. There's no need to put the whole list at the very top of the blog post. Google actually will look at your subheadings and see that it's a list, and they'll treat it as such when they create an answer target out of it. We do find that oftentimes, if it's in a list format, it can often be helpful to write a number at the beginning of each of the list items. It does help Google identify that it's in a list format, but it also is just kind of nice for the reader to see, like, oh, there's number 1, number 2, number 3. So if it makes sense for the content that you're creating, that can be a great way to format the article. So before the list items, we'll usually have a little bit of an introduction. It does make sense to give some background of what's going on in this blog post, but then we're going to have the 9 items, a subheading with the content for that specific item in the list. Then the next item as a subheading, and then the content below it. At the end of the article, you can choose to write a conclusion or not. Oftentimes that ends up being kind of just fluff anyway. People came for the content of the list. So how to succeed well with list style staple posts? First of all, remember what you learned on answer targets, creating list style answer targets. 9 items or more is a great way to get Google to actually send you traffic, because they're only going to show up to 8 of the items in the list. The next really important thing to do is to have each item in the list be a really good standalone item. If you were to write an article about tips for marathons for the first time you run a marathon, having tips like drink enough water, well, you may go into a lot of detail about what that means down below, but the tip looks super obvious. And so even if it did get used as the snippet, it's going to look really obvious. It's not going to look like your tips are very good. Make it a complete thought. Just don't go too long. Try to keep it under 60 characters, but have it be a complete thought. That goes into the next piece of advice, which is to include the more obvious tips that everybody's using, but to include them in a unique and helpful way. Now, first of all, the reason that we want to include the tips that all of the other blogs share as well is for something we call confirmation consensus. When Google sees a question being asked, and they see that most of the articles that cover the answer to that question have basically the same general answers, they see that as probably the most likely true or correct or helpful answer. And so if you then have a list of items that totally differs from that, then it makes your content be a little bit suspect in Google's eyes. They don't know the true answer. So they're relying on that consensus of other content creators. And so whatever matches the consensus is most likely to be what's considered accurate according to Google. However, if we don't do anything to differ our content from the consensus, then how does your content stand out? So let's go back to the marathon example. Instead of your subheading saying something like drink enough water, you're going to do the research anyway, right? So you could go do your research. Maybe you'll find a medical study. Maybe you'll look at OSHA recommendations for people who work in, long hours in hot and hard work conditions, and see how much water they recommend, and gather some information together. Maybe you could even do a survey of people that run marathons in a Facebook group for long distance runners, and find out some basic information, maybe their height, weight, gender, and how much water they drink during a marathon. Now you can aggregate that data, and your subheading could be something like, plan to drink 2 liters of water, like during the race, right? That's your subheading. Again, wordsmith it to get it under 60 characters. And then you can go into detail about how they should determine the correct amount for them, but maybe on average it's whatever the average is, 2 liters. But then you make a table that says, hey, based upon your gender, your size, your height, your weight, that kind of stuff, here's how much water you should plan to drink, on average at least, over the course of the race. That's going to be super helpful information, but the subheading lets me know how helpful that is, right? Instead of pace yourself, which is an important tip, but again, it's one of the obvious ones, you may say, Plan for an 8-minute and 27-second mile during your race. And whatever the number is, it should maybe be the average that you get, and just try to find some numbers that represent kind of average marathon times for first-time marathon runners. Again, a survey may be a great way to get that kind of information. And then you can explain below that kind of what the range is, what's normal, and then give people advice that based upon their training, they should know what's a comfortable mile for them. And then they should use a watch to make sure that they're not overdoing it in the first few miles. That's the easiest way to get burned out. I mean, you can see how framing the tips in a little bit better way and in a more specific way makes them more helpful and more unique, but still plays in to that confirmation consensus. Now, there are kind of two variations a little bit of list style posts. One is like an ideas list. It's kind of inspiration. Usually in an ideas list, I'm looking for inspiration to find kind of the one thing that I want to do. Whereas in a list of that's more advice, maybe tips, it may be that multiple items in that list are totally applicable to me. And I really do want your advice and input. And sometimes they kind of overlap. Sometimes people are looking for inspiration, but they want you to tell them what's the right answer, which one should I pick. Let me give you an example. Years ago, we wrote this article, 50 niche site ideas ripe for the taking. And we were constantly just updating this and removing some and adding new ones all the time of these ideas for niche websites and putting in some good information about each one. We haven't updated this in quite a while now. But you can see that in each one, there's some specifics, how we would monetize it, what type of site it is. It's pretty cool information, and it's a long list. And still, we would get people that say, yeah, but which one's the best? Well, obviously, there's not any one best. The best way to write this post is just to have a lot of ideas to give people inspiration, to let them see that they can pick any of these or take an idea and use that as the start of a brainstorming path. Since then, we've put out lists with over 1,000 ideas for potentially good niche websites. And so people are just looking for inspiration there. On the other hand, here's one that's more of a tips style post. This is 9 internet marketing hacks that actually work. And in here, we just share some interesting hacks that we've used before that can help drive more traffic or drive more engagement, especially if you have a product to sell. Things like a hidden party coupon, things like the check the price over on Amazon to get people to actually click the link whether they're ready to buy or not. These are each actually tips where any reader could potentially implement multiple of these. A couple of warnings that I want to give you when it comes to this. There are some types of inspiration style blog posts where, again, based upon the number guide or the length guidelines we've given you, you're going to feel like you have to write 2,000 words. But it may be that it's a type of blog post where people are looking more for visual inspiration than written inspiration. For example, 19 great Caribbean locations for destination weddings. You probably should focus more on the photos and a little bit less on the text. And so you should definitely think about the best format for your list. It's still a staple post, even if it ends up with less than 1,000 words, as long as the best format is going to be something else. It could be photos, could be short little video clips, and these could be things that you crowdsource from people on Facebook, again, who have been to all these destinations, if that's not something that you have. And the next warning that I give you is to not just make a list super long just for the sake of making it long. Rather than making your headline better or more intriguing by just making your number bigger, it's better to include a blog post with just better tips that people are more likely to stay on, to actually go scroll through. That's going to actually be a better signal to Google. And in terms of getting people to click on it, we just need to work on writing better headlines, not necessarily having a higher number. We're going to talk more about headlines in a different lesson. Now, along those lines of number of items in the list, I know I did say that ideally we want at least 9 items in the list. We talk about that in the Answer Target course as well. But the reality is there are times when 4 or 5 or 6 items in a list, 4 or 5 or 6 tips for a specific thing is the appropriate amount. And adding any more will require you to scrape the bottom of the barrel. We never want to be at a point where we're giving tips that are basically meaningless and aren't overly helpful. And so only include the number of tips that make sense for the content that you're creating, even if it means that you're not going to get the view more items link at the bottom of an answer target. You still want to make sure that your blog post isn't filled with fluff. but is entirely filled with the absolute best and most helpful content that you can create for that reader.